Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Want to wish everybody happy Star Wars Day. Happy May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. Obviously, this meme, May the 4th, came about because of the phrase commonly used in Star Wars, May the Force. And it was something in meme culture that Star Wars fans started doing, and it really caught on. And Disney and Lucasfilm have done it, have adapted it or adapted it and adopted it to fit their own needs. And they've done Star Wars celebrations, big unveils, and I'm sure the 2022 edition will um, be more of the same. Probably they'll do the Kenobi unveil because Ewan McGregor is coming back as Obi-Wan Kenobi in the prequel to uh, Phantom Menace. No, excuse me, the sequel to Phantom Menace, the sequel to the prequel trilogy, the time in between uh, Episode 4 and Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, when he's on Tatooine, he's the guardian of Luke, and he is watching over Luke so that the Empire and the dark side and his father, Darth Vader, don't get a hold of him. That is what is supposed to be the premise of it, which would be interesting to tell that story because it's like, what happened to Obi Wan that made him age so much? Like you see how young and youthful Ewan McGregor was in Episode 3, and then you see Alec Guinness and how older he looked. Now I know it's different actors, obviously in the real world, but in terms of the storyline of Star Wars, what happened in between that time that made Obi Wan age so much? There's talk, of course, bringing back Ray Park as um, as Darth Maul, Darth Maul, because he was probably one of the greatest things about the prequels. When they first came out in 1999, people didn't really like the prequels. They thought they were kind of boring, and especially Episode 1, Phantom Menace, were kind of unnecessary because we all imagined that the prequel, the story of Anakin Skywalker, would start when he was a teenager. Like, for example, episode um, where episode 2 starts, but it doesn't. It starts at episode 1, him as a little kid, a slave child born on Tatooine to Shmi Skywalker and owned by Watto. And nobody really cares really about him as a whiny little kid, and flying his plane and blowing up the Trade Federation ship in episode 1. So people are like, why start with him as a kid? Start with him as a cool teenager and then show the progression of how he became Darth Vader over time. But of course, George Lucas, wanting to capitalize on that really, really younger audience, I guess his kids at the time were really, really young. So he really wanted to get the young audience and get them to sell toys. So he put in not only a young Anakin Skywalker, but a Jar Jar Binks, the Gungan character. The Jar Jar was the key to all this. Jar Jar was the one that uh, basically won the war for the people of Naboo and the Gungans against the Nemoidians and the Trade Federation. So if it wasn't for Jar Jar being the commander of the Gungans, no, nothing would have happened, obviously. So they thought they could have the same effect that they had when they introduced Yoda, and everyone loved Yoda, and he became a pop culture phenomenon. Same with R2D2, same with Chewbacca. Those really weird alien type characters that become iconic with the franchise. But Jar Jar backfired, and unfortunately for the actor that played Jar Jar, at my best, my best, was, fans tortured him. They made fun of him. They made his life a living hell, and it really affected him, psychologically, as it did, I'm sure, all of the uh, Episode 1 actors, including the young man who played Anakin Skywalker, Jake Lloyd. He thought Here he is playing in Star Wars. Star Wars by that time, 1999, was already iconic. It was already, um, one of the best films ever made. The franchise was well known. Since it came on the scene in May of 1977, it was a cultural phenomenon. So 20, 20 years later, of course, you're thinking as a kid, being Jake Lloyd, I'm playing this iconic role, and against Skywalker, I'm going to be as synonymous with pop culture as Mark Hamill, synonymous with pop culture as Harrison Ford or as Carrie Fisher, but he did not because of the way the character was structured. Same thing with Hayden Christensen. When Hayden Christensen played him in episode two and episode three, respectively, even though people like episode three, they like Revenge of the Sith. Revenge of the Sith. Of the three prequel films, they say that probably is the best one because he turns into Darth Vader, right? And we start to see his progression towards the dark side even more forcefully, especially when he kills um, Count Dooku and he does something that a Jedi is not supposed to do. He kills somebody. We start to see his progression more towards the dark side. I mean, he killed the Sand People in episode two, but that was a personal thing. That was about his mother. But this is more like having to do with the intergalactic war, with Count Dooku leading the enemy forces, the separatist forces, and also Count Dooku being a Sith, and Anakin being a Jedi goes into all of that. And you know that was the cool part. But the other lame part was the dialogue, the wooden dialogue. Some of the things he said to Padme were kind of awkward and kind of weird, kind of really forced, kind of cringy. Some of his things that he did, like when he turned to the dark side and he killed. Who could forget that line that Natalie Portman, who played Queen Amidala, delivers to Ewan McGregor, and she's like, uh, she's asking him about what happened with Anakin. Why isn't she heard from him? Because obviously she's pregnant with the twins, Luke and Leia, but she hasn't heard from him. And he goes to her and he tells her that in the temple, Anakin killed the younglings. And just being called the younglings, as Ewan McGregor is delivering this line, um, you could see him covering up his mouth, wanting to laugh, because George Lucas was never a person that was really known for the dialogue. Um, THX 1138, was his first film that he did in USC when he was a student. It was like documentary based. When he was getting into, becoming a fan of movie making in the late '60s and early to mid '70s, he was focusing a lot on Japanese films, a lot on film noir, which is more focused on less on dialogue and story and more focused on um, scenes, and it tells a story through the visuals more so than the dialogue. So his dialogue was never going to be great. And plus, we know as Star Wars fans the stories about when he was actually writing Star Wars in the beginning, how he was struggling with the creative process, struggling on what to say, struggling on how to articulate it, how to put it together, so much so that he was cutting his own hair and filling his wastebasket with his own hair out of stress. You know what I mean? So he admits that he was never much of a good writer, but it's really ironic that this modern myth, this monomyth, if you will, coming out of a man who isn't really, you know, who says he's not really good with words and not really good with storytelling. That's really strange because you wouldn't think that. How would he be able to produce such a critical and a commercial masterpiece, being that he was so inept at writing? So I don't really know if that's really true. I mean, I know. that he took from various places. He took from Flash Gordon, obviously, pulp comics of the 1930s and 40s, World War II movies of the 1930s and 40s, and various mythologies. For example, the Odyssey, the Iliad, um, Japanese mythology, Taoist mythology, Taoist Chinese mythology. Took a lot of stuff from that, and of course, biblical literature as well. The whole idea of Anakin being born of a virgin, that's not something only that we see in the Bible, but we see in Semitic cultures, surrounding um, the Mediterranean pre-Christianity. We see it in the stories of Dionysus, who was the Greek god who was called Bacchus in Roman mythology. Um, and we see it in Horus in Egyptian mythology, pre-Christian Egyptian mythology. So we see it in a lot of different sort of mythologies. This idea of being born of a virgin, even the origin story of Buddha, as told in Buddhism. I don't know, his mom's not a virgin necessarily, but she's born out of his side in some kind of miraculous birth, this chosen one, prophecy and lore that's kind of surrounding religion. And then, like the real life historical narratives that he borrowed from. Obviously, the collapse of the Roman Republic, and the Republic in Star Wars morphs into an empire in the same way as the Roman Republic morphed into the Roman Empire before the people's very eyes, and they never actually saw it coming. They never actually saw dictatorship and tyranny even coming. It happened right in front of them, and they couldn't even notice it. You know what I mean? So that he took from that. Also, he took from the idea of a impoverished society, like um, you know, or as he called it, a primitive society, like for example, the colonial United States going up against a big empire, or us, the United States, being the colonial empire post World War II, taking on the Vietnamese, which was something that was going on at the time that he was writing Star Wars, or it was about to come to an end. You know what I mean? Our conflicts in Southeast Asia. And he drew a lot of inspiration from that. In fact, the original basis for Palpatine was based on Richard Nixon, who was president of the United States at the time that Lucas started writing Star Wars in 1968. Other things that he took from his own life, of course, George Lucas, growing up in rural Modesto, California, he was a car enthusiast, and he raced cars, for fun, and was something that he really wanted to do when he was younger before his accident. And he got into that accident. It was a near-death experience, and but he incorporated into his movies not only Star Wars, with you see like Han Solo being a spaceship enthusiast and being a really technocratic and being into a lot of technology and a lot of mechanics, but you also see that in American Graffiti, which was Lucas's first big commercial hit, which included Harrison Ford and included Ron Howard, both of whom have worked on Star Wars in the past. So it's funny because in 2018, Solo, even though Lucas is no longer directly in charge of it anymore, selling it to Disney in 2012, you do see um, with Ron Howard directing it some of that American Graffiti element with um, how it starts off on Corellia with Han Solo. So there's so much integrated into it: biblical lore, Greek Greco-Roman mythology, um, Asian mythology, and Asian philosophy, Eastern philosophy integrated into it. The Jedi have been said to draw inspiration from not only the samurai of pre-Meiji Restoration Japan, but feudal Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate, during the Middle Ages, but also draw inspiration from the Knights Templar, the special elite forces that were involved with uh, the Crusades. Those guys that wore the breastplate with the shield of Christ, which basically looked like St. George's cross on there. They're kind of based on that. And it was interesting that somebody said how Order 66, which was Palpatine's massacre of the whole Jedi, the Jedi Purge was based on King Philip of France basically purging the Knights Templar on the behalf of the Pope. So like you can see all these historical parallels, and of course, the direct parallels to the rise of fascism through electoral politics. Because let's face it, Palpatine got into office through electoral politics. Just like Hitler, they granted him the emergency powers. He started wars just so that he could use it as a reason to accumulate more power through politics. And what does Queen Amidala say? And this kind of came to my mind. Um, when we're talking about the abortion issue with Roe v. Wade, it's like everyone that is applauding this whole, you know, uh, infringement upon personal liberties is the same thing that Queen Amidala said when Palpatine declared that the Republic will now turn into an empire. This is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause. You know what I mean? So you could have your liberties, you could have your civil liberties stripped away from you piece by piece. And just like the citizens of the Galactic Republic and of the Roman Republic in history, you won't even know it because you won't even see it coming. You're so caught up in your daily minutia and your daily day to day mundane routine that you don't even see that each and every day, piece by piece, your rights are being stripped away, your personal freedoms and your personal liberties, because you think, oh, well, it doesn't affect me necessarily at all or me directly, but it may not affect you directly because that particular situation doesn't really have anything to do with you, but it will affect you in the end because what undergirds that judgment is, liberty, which we all, want, and liberty and freedom to do as we please. And it's interesting too how people are guided and people are manipulated, like Anakin was manipulated by Palpatine to the point where he thought he was doing the right thing. You know what I mean? Um, he and Obi Wan are fighting on Mustafar, and what does he say? He says, "From my point of view," Obi Wan says to him, "Senator Palpatine is evil," and Anakin says to Obi Wan, "From my point of view, the Jedi are evil." So he allowed Senator Palpatine to twist his mind to such a degree that what he was fighting against was what he ultimately became. And I see a lot of people like that. They started off fighting for freedom and their heart was in the right place. As the saying goes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But at the same time, they got to such a level that now they are themselves they are their own, they are the enemy that they were trying to destroy, just like Anakin. He was supposed to destroy the Sith, and what automatically does he do? He himself joins the Sith and he brings unbalance to the Force by completely eliminating the light side of the Force. And that can happen in modern discourse. Of course, what Lucas in 2005 was really referencing at that time was how our freedoms were being stripped away by virtue of the Patriot Act passed by George W. Bush during George W. Bush's administration in the mid 2000s. And people thought it was justified because why? Well, we're in a war, so under a war, there has to be certain circumstances, there has to be certain civil liberties, um, taken away or stripped away from the populace, just like in Star Wars, where they felt it was necessary. Oh, for our safety and security, we'll trade our freedom for safety and security. We'll trade our liberties for safety and security. And that's exactly what they did. They thought that the Republic was under threat from this internal rebellion, and then they were convinced that the Jedi, who were the good guys, the Jedi that were fighting for freedom and fighting for liberty, were actually the bad guys. And with the Jedi, they were so dogmatic and they were so, religiously oriented that they didn't see themselves, you know, that um, uh, the the dark side of the force was on the rise. They didn't see themselves that it was the dark side of the force that was clouding their judgment. They were so arrogant and they were so conceited in their ways, in their in their conceit and their arrogance that they didn't see it, which is something that Luke points out in episode 7 when he has the discussion with Rey of why the Jedi failed and why not just the Jedi failed one time, but the Jedi failed twice. You know, why his Jedi Academy was destroyed. Of course, the Jedi purged the first time, Order 66, but even the second time when it was destroyed, when Kylo Ren rose to power. Because he thought in his conceit that he had destroyed the dark side. But see, you never really destroy evil. The battle between good and evil and the battle between freedom, justice and equality and tyranny is never really over. You know what I mean? So just because you destroy it, in one instance, like Anakin ultimately destroyed it by throwing Palpatine down that shaft and killing Palpatine. But what happens in Episode 9? Palpatine reemerges. So, like Palpatine said in Episode 9, many times I have died, and I've always, many times I have died. So, Palpatine being the personification of evil, both in the mystical sense, in terms of the Jedi, or in the political sense terms of being a political tyrant when he was Senator Palpatine, and then when he turns to Darth Sidious, he's Darth Sidious. He's a mystical leader. He is a cultist leader, hidden in the shadows and whatever, having Darth Maul do his bidding, or having Count Dooku, Darth Tyrannus, do his bidding, and in the mystical sense. But in the political sense, he's a tyrant as well. He's willing to strip away the rights and the dissent of the people at the cost of peace. It's sort of like that old Roman quote. They create they create a desert and call it peace. Peace at what cost? Peace at the destruction of an opposition. Peace at the silencing of an opposition. If you're willing to want peace, but it's peace at the hand of a gun and peace in terms of surrender, then that's not a true peace. That's just cowardice. You know what I mean? You're saying, "Oh, I want peace," but then your peace is the silence and complete destruction of another oppositional force. Nah, that's not real peace. That's just domination. You know what I mean? So remember the part. Remember the part when he's talking to Anakin. He says, "The Jedi will be destroyed, and then we shall have peace." Well, that's a lot like our current political discourse, where we're saying, "Oh, we want peace, we want civility," but peace and civility at what cost? Peace and civility at the cost of complete surrender. That's what they're essentially talking about. Is like peace and civility at the cost of surrendering your ideals, morals, and the things you think are right and just. And then Anakin, what I always found interesting about the whole Anakin psychological profile is how he starts off wanting to do the right thing. The one thing that he wants, the one thing that he desires, is that his wife Padme doesn't die because he deals with abandonment issues a lot throughout um, his story. Of course, he doesn't have a father, right? He is a slave. He doesn't have ownership of his own person. But when he becomes emancipated, he joins the Jedi Order. With the Jedi Order is really restrictive. The Jedi Order is really religious. The Jedi Order, doesn't allow you to have parents. And in the beginning, Yoda says he's too old to begin the training. Well, Luke Skywalker was even older, but take away the technicality. But anyway, uh, Anakin is too old because he's already been attached to his mother. When they take the kids away to train them as a Jedi, they're really young, like they're infants. You know what I mean? So they don't have any emotional connection yet with any of their parents, but Anakin did have that. And when the scene when he's walking away in episode one and his mom, and he looks back at his mom because he wanted to come back and he wanted to come back and he wanted to free her. He wanted to destroy the whole slave society and come back and free his mother and come back and free the people of Tatooine because Tatooine is like a Western, an old Western outpost. It's away from civilization. It is completely run by these huts, like Jabba, these gangsters, these outlaws. There is no centralized jurisdiction, which Padme, when she goes there, with Qui Gon Jinn and Obi Wan, she's surprised to learn. It'd be like if a Washington bureaucrat suddenly stepped into your hood. You know what I'm saying? And then they would be like, "Oh, I didn't know it was this bad. Why isn't the government doing anything about this, urban decay?" But of course, they're not doing anything about it because of heavy bureaucracy. The government, the people in Coruscant, in their case, in the Star Wars context, turned a blind eye to what was going on in the outer rim, in the planets that they didn't care about, the planets that were filled with probably alien species and people that beings that were second class citizens, and they allowed the gangsters and the thugs to run the place, and the gangsters and the thugs, the outlaws of the society, created their own moral, their own moral and economic system, and the government was not going to step in. And here she is, a politician. She was posing as a handmaiden, but she was a politician, and she's like, totally shocked that this is going on. Oh, there's still slavery, you know, in this part of the world. Kind of reminds me of when I would, hear these stories about these Westerners that they would travel to Middle Eastern or North African or Sub-Saharan African countries after slavery was over, after the 1880s. Basically, slavery was over in most of the Americas, and it would kind of remind me, you know, I would hear these, traveling logs of other people after that, post that from the West going to these other parts of the world, and still in utter shock, still in utter amazement that this kind of debasement and this kind of um, fucked up, for lack of a better term, cultural practices like slavery or sati, wife burning in India, went on, or foot binding in China, these really audacious things that us in the West had already gotten rid of. You know what I mean? Our those travelers and those explorers and those businessmen or merchants, went to those villages and those really rural areas, and they're like, wait a minute, what? This still goes on? Even here in the United States, like people, coastal people from the East Coast, already settled civilizations, will go to like the South. Like, for example, I can't even think of his name, but the guy that was involved with the central planning of Central Park. He was known for traveling around the South, and when he traveled to the South, to the deep South, like Mississippi, Texas, and stuff, he he was shocked basically on what was really going on in these places. You know, like he was like, "Oh, I can't believe that this is still going on because it was not a part of his cultural experience." And that was just like Padme. She was like, "Oh, I can't believe this is really going on." And of course, she that would then prompt her to want to give up her queenship and become a senator and become the kind of social justice warrior that she wanted to become. But see, Anakin, he had that social justice spirit too. He wanted to make things uh, things right with the world as well. But he wanted to do it in such a wrong way. You know, he wanted to do it through brute force. He wanted to. He was kind of like. Um, he was kind of like Vladimir Lenin. You know, Vladimir Lenin and even Karl Marx himself. You know, they had this utopian image where they would fight for the workers. You know, workers of the world unite. This whole Marxist ideology, and they were going to enforce it at the hand of a gun, even if they had to cause a tremendous amount of suffering and tremendous amount of death and tremendous amount of destruction. They were going to impose on the populace their idea of justice. You know, by any means necessary. That was basically Anakin's, political philosophy. Was he really educated on the ins and outs? Was he really educated on how um, the Republic really worked? No, he really wasn't. But because he because he had this desire, because he had this want, and he had this need to, make everything right with the world and put everything in what he perceived to be as the appropriate box, he was willing to do anything to make that happen. And he saw the accumulation of power by a segment of society like the Jedi. It's kind of like another comparison would be atheist atheist zealots, people like Richard Dawkins, right? They are atheist zealots. They perceive a lot of injustices with the world, and they perceive a lot of those injustices and a lot of the economic hardships and the personal hardships that people around the world, especially in the third world, deal with, emanating from the control of religious elites. So because um, with the religious in their minds, the religious elites are causing all this, repression and suppression of people's rights, people's personal liberties, and people's, um, keeping them poor, being the opiate of the masses. Basically, another take on Marxism without the authoritarian politics. They are willing to blame all the ills of society on this religious apparatus, fairly or unfairly. Were the Jedi somewhat restrictive? Were they somewhat dogmatic? Yes, that's why they ultimately failed. You know what I mean? But were the Jedi a good thing for society? Was the Jedi something, an institution that young people could be plugged into in um, the Galactic Republic society that would benefit, young men? Would be an outlet for their aggression? Sure, the Jedi was that. Were the Jedi great peacekeepers? Were they great negotiators? When it came to that, sometimes they were, sometimes they weren't. But I think the ultimate failing of uh, the Jedi was that they didn't ever think they would be defeated. Here they exiled the Sith for 1,000 years in the Republic, and they didn't think ever that they would ever be defeated. They were too conceited. They were too arrogant in their estimation of of their opponents. And if it's just like with Mike Tyson. When Mike Tyson fought Buster Douglas, he assumed that Buster Douglas was not a worthy opponent. So he made the most fatal flaw that you could ever make in combat in terms, you know, is underestimating your opponent, underestimating what your opponent is actually capable of. Anyway, guys, may the fourth be with you. Star Wars is a mega monomyth celebration. It's a it's modern mythology. It's the modern equivalent of the Iliad and the Odyssey, with the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid and King Arthur's legends and the Chants de Roland were for French, British, Roman, and Greek, ancient Greek society. That is what Star Wars is for us. What the Mahabharata is for Hindu society, that is what Star Wars is for us. It's just like the Mahabharata, in the sense that um, it is a war, just like the Iliad is a war between the Greeks and the Trojans, and just like the Mahabharata is a war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. This is a war too between Sith and the Jedi. And what do the Sith and the Jedi represent? One represents hedonism and the desire for passion and the accumulation of power, and one is supposed to represent selflessness. But as as um, as Palpatine points out in that famous scene with Anakin, he says the Jedi are selfless. The Sith are about power. You know, the Sith are about the accumulation of power. And he looks over and he says, when the Jedi aren't that, you know. And the origin of Star Wars and how it came to be and how it came about is very convoluted, and in and of itself is a very interesting story. Of course, George Lucas, wanting to get the rights to Flash Gordon, was not able to. Wanting to work on Apocalypse Now, which he never got the chance to. His friend and mentor, his second father, if you will, Francis Ford Coppola, did get the chance to work on that and did do that. And he wanted to create his own war epic, and out of scratch and a little bit of influence, a lot of influence actually from the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, he was able to do that. And he took, and of course Frank Hubert's Doom and Isaac M. Uh, Asimov, yeah, Asimov. I don't know. Isaac Asimov, fiction, he was able to do that, and he created something new. So out of different pieces of different fragments of different other mythologies, and through the influence of Joseph Campbell, who wrote the book Hero of a Thousand Faces, Lucas was able to create something new and something that still resonates with us today, because the ultimate battle between good and evil is something that will resonate with people for generations and generations. We can draw all these kind of comparisons and all these kinds of parallels, in the Bible, in Greco-Roman mythology, and Indo-Aryan mythology, but ultimately it was something different, and now it's metamorphosized into something completely else. Anyway, guys, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell button to see when my next video is coming out. Love you.